It started with a pill bottle and a lie. I'm Lydia Harper, and for years my Aunt Genevieve made me feel like the invisible woman, the charity case, who was just the help to my ailing grandfather Arthur. When I brought him home to his sprawling, opulent mansion for Thanksgiving, the house felt more like a stage for an execution. I'd been grieving his rapid mental decline, but then I found the unmarked sedative. That's when I realized the horrifying truth. My aunt wasn't waiting for him to slip. She was actively poisoning him to steal the legacy Arthur had secretly secured for me. Now, to save the man I love, I had to expose her criminal enterprise over a holiday dinner. Everything was on the line. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. It was a crisp November Tuesday, the kind where the sky is a hard, bright blue that hurts your eyes. I was 3 hours deep into debugging a client's e-commerce cart, the cursor blinking, mocking at me when my phone lit up with the one name I never wanted to see: Aunt Genevieve. I let it ring twice just to pretend I had a choice. I muted my Lo-Fi Beats to Code 2 playlist and picked up, leaning my forehead against the cool glass of my apartment window. "Hi, Aunt Genevieve." "Lydia." Her voice was exactly as I remembered, like cold porcelain, no warmth, just a smooth, hard surface. "I trust you're both well." It wasn't a question. "We're holding Thanksgiving at the house this year, Thursday, 2 o'clock sharp. You'll bring Arthur, of course." Of course, not an invitation, a summons. The annual Harper Thanksgiving held at the sprawling family estate I'd never not once felt welcome in. This would be the first one since Graham's passed, and the thought of that house without her soft presence made my stomach clench. Genevieve didn't wait for a reply. "He'll need something appropriate to wear. I won't have him looking disheveled in front of our guests. See to it." The line clicked before I could even say goodbye. I let out a breath I'd been holding since I saw her name. My apartment, usually a cozy, functional space, suddenly felt like a shoebox. This was my life, a 29-year-old freelance web developer and full-time caregiver to the most brilliant man I'd ever known. My grandfather, Arthur Harper. The man who taught me how to read blueprints before I could read books. The man who used to design skyscrapers now spent his days struggling to remember my name. I was exhausted, running on fumes and lukewarm coffee, juggling PHP scripts with his medication schedule. But he was my grandfather, and I was fiercely, terrifyingly protective of him. I knew this trip was a bad idea. To Genevieve, I wasn't family. I was a function, the unpaid help, the disappointing granddaughter who didn't marry rich, who worked with her hands, who was saddled with the burden of Arthur. I ran my hands through my messy bun, the familiar dread settling in. I'd just find an excuse, a work deadline, a cough, anything. I turned to go to the kitchen and my heart stopped. Arthur was standing in the hallway, his thin frame silhouetted by the light from his bedroom. I hadn't even heard him get up. Most days his eyes were clouded, lost in a fog only he could see. But not now. Now his eyes were sharp. They were lucid, and they were filled with a raw animal terror. He had heard. "Liddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. He gripped my arm, his fingers surprisingly strong, his knuckles white. Don't let her take the house." My blood went cold. "What? Gramps, what are you talking about? It's just Thanksgiving dinner." "No." He shook his head, a frantic, jerky motion. She was here." He was agitated now, his gaze darting around my apartment, as if Genevieve might be hiding behind the curtains. The green box, Liddy. She hates the color green. A green box." I had no idea what he meant. "Gramps, you're safe here. She's not here. It's okay." "No," he insisted, his voice rising with a desperate, sudden strength. "The house. Helen's house. You have to. The green box. Don't let her. Please." He was trembling, the lucidity already fading, the terror remaining. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, and for a second he wasn't a confused old man. He was my grandfather, trapped and terrified, begging me for help. The confusion over the green box was a dull hum beneath the blaring siren of his fear. This wasn't the gentle confusion of his dementia. This was dread. He was afraid of his own daughter. And I, who had spent the last 2 years protecting him from falls from hot stoves, from wandering out the front door, I had never ever seen him like this. My decision was made in that instant. The freelance gig could wait. My exhaustion didn't matter. I smoothed his hair back from his forehead, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "Okay, Gramps, it's okay. I hear you." I kissed his temple. "We'll go. We'll go for Thanksgiving. And I'll find out what's going on. I promise, I won't let her hurt you." He sagged against me, the fight going out of him, the fog rolling back in. "Okay, Liddy. Okay." If I'd known, if I'd had any idea that bringing my grandfather home for Thanksgiving would mean burning his entire world to the ground just to save him, I might have stayed in that tiny apartment. I might have bolted the door, turned off my phone, and pretended the world didn't exist. But I didn't. I led him back to his room. I packed his bag, including the soft, worn-out sweater I knew he loved. I kissed his forehead, and I drove us both straight into the fire. The Harper estate didn't just look expensive, it looked indifferent. The long, winding driveway was perfectly swept, lined by bare maples that stood like stiff, silent sentinels. The house itself, a sprawling limestone manor designed by Arthur himself, was lit up for the holidays, every window glowing, but the effect was less cozy and more stage-managed. It was a magazine spread no one was allowed to touch. It felt cold, sterile, and wrong. As I helped Arthur out of the car, adjusting his favorite worn oatmeal-colored sweater, the front door swung open. Genevieve stood framed in the massive oak doorway, a vision of holiday perfection in a cashmere turtleneck and tailored trousers. Her smile was immediate and wide, a social weapon she wielded with expert precision, but the ice in her eyes never thawed. "Darling Lydia, you made it," she chimed, her voice echoing in the cavernous marble foyer. She didn't move to hug me. She moved straight to Arthur. "Father, my dear, you look wonderful." She cooed at him, her hands clasping his, her affection possessive and theatrical. "Oh, my word! Lydia, why on earth is he wearing that?" She gestured with obvious distaste at his sweater, the one he always wore when he was relaxed. "It's comfortable, Aunt Genevieve. It's his favorite." She barely glanced at me. "Nonsense. This is a holiday, not a convalescence. I have something waiting for him." She steered Arthur away, dismissing me entirely. "Robert," she barked, and my uncle, her husband, materialized from the shadows near the library. He looked thinner than I remembered his usually jovial face, etched with an exhaustion that mirrored my own. "Take Father up to the blue room, please. I'll send up the tray with his new clothes." Robert just nodded, his eyes avoiding mine. I felt the familiar ache of being invisible. I wasn't a guest. I was the chauffeur, the delivery service. The next 24 hours were a masterclass in slow, escalating humiliation. Genevieve treated me with an airy, practiced dismissal, 1,000 tiny cuts, designed to reinforce my place in the family hierarchy low. At the pre-Thanksgiving cocktail hour, she introduced me to the mayor and the head of the local historical society. "And this is Lydia," she announced brightly, placing a manicured hand on my shoulder. "Arthur's? Well, she manages his affairs, his nurse essentially, so dedicated." I felt the blood rush to my face. I opened my mouth to correct her. "I'm his granddaughter. I'm a developer. I'm his primary connection to the world." But the word nurse had already done its job. Their expressions shifted from polite interest to condescending sympathy. I spent the next hour leaning against a wall, nursing a glass of sparkling water, feeling the weight of their judgment. Later, over a dinner of roasted quail, which I, the vegetarian, watched everyone else eat, she launched into a story about my cousin, her son. He just closed a major deal. A real developer, unlike some people who dabble in, well, apps. The slight was casual sharp and delivered with a blindingly fake smile directed straight at me. She wasn't subtle, she was ruthless. The worst part was watching how she handled Arthur. Every time he tried to tell a fragmented story, she would gently interrupt, cooing, "Oh, father, let's talk about that later." She redirected his attention away from me constantly. When I mentioned his favorite old jazz record, she cut in, "Yes, darling. Now, Arthur, remember how proud you were of Lucas's acceptance letter." Arthur would look confused, but he'd submit to her theatrical affection. It made my skin crawl. It wasn't reassurance, it was control. That night, after everyone retired, I couldn't sleep. Arthur's words, "the green box," were a loop in my mind. I put on a pair of sweats and slipped down the grand staircase. Genevieve's room was dark. The house was silent. I knew my grandfather's study well. It was still filled with his sketches, his blueprints, his beautiful, impossible visions. In a corner, tucked away behind a stack of architecture journals, I found a simple leather-bound hat box. It wasn't old and weathered, though. It was new. And it was deep, deep green. My heart hammered against my ribs. I opened it. Inside it was a shrine to my grandmother Helen. Old photographs, ticket stubs from Paris, a dried corsage. But tucked beneath the last photograph was a small recent stack of glossy high-resolution pictures. They weren't of Helen. They were of a woman I didn't recognize, beautiful with sharp, intelligent eyes, standing alone on a snowy terrace. Why were these here? It was strange, a misplaced item in Arthur's careful chaos. I slid them out, perplexed, and tucked them into my jeans pocket. As I closed the box, I noticed something else, a small plastic prescription-style pill bottle hidden beneath the lining. It was empty. The label was typed cheap and unprofessional, A's AM, daily, as needed. I looked closer. There was no pharmacy name, no doctor's name, and no drug information. Just those 3 words. This was immediately wrong. I managed Arthur's actual medications, and they were all labeled with his official clinic white bottle's distinct logos. This looked like something bought online, a generic bottle repurposed. A cold knot of dread tightened in my stomach. What exactly was A's AM? I slipped the empty bottle into my pocket, the plastic cool against my palm. I needed to call his doctor discreetly. I headed toward the kitchen where my phone got the best signal. As I rounded the corner into the back hallway, I heard voices coming from Genevieve's closed office door. I froze, flattening myself against the cold wall. It was Genevieve. Her voice was low and intense, devoid of all her usual polished sweetness. She was on speakerphone. "I don't care what the optics are, Gerald. You've seen the reports. He's barely holding a thought. The foundation transfer needs to be complete by Monday. That means he needs to be declared fully incompetent before the holiday is over. It needs to be swift and ironclad. Get it done. I'm counting on you, Gerald. This house is riding on this." The line went dead. My own breathing sounded deafening in the silence. It wasn't just humiliation. It wasn't just greed. It was a race against time. Genevieve wasn't waiting for Arthur to decline. She was actively trying to destroy him and his legacy before she could be stopped. The green box, the strange pills, the dismissal, it all slammed into place. I felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and immediate. The trap had sprung and we were already inside. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bedroom, the flimsy plastic pill bottle and the photos of the strange woman spread out on the duvet like evidence. The words Genevieve spoke to her lawyer echoed in my head. Declare him fully incompetent before the holiday is over. My focus had utterly changed. This wasn't about navigating a cruel family dinner. This was about survival. I was no longer just defending my grandfather from emotional harm. I was defending him from a calculated act of sabotage. The moment the sun rose, I was on the phone tucked away in the walk-in closet, where the thick walls muffled my voice. I called Arthur's neurologist, bypassing the receptionist by sounding frantic because I was. I read the mysterious typed label, A's AM daily as needed. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and heavy. Then the doctor spoke, his voice low and concerned. Lydia, that's not a prescription I wrote. That's not a medication we would ever use. He paused, a professional assessment replacing the shock, based on that description and the fact that it was administered outside of our protocol. It sounds highly suspect. If that was a high-dose sedative, possibly an off-label anti-anxiety compound used chronically, it wouldn't just cloud his memory. It would induce symptoms mimicking advanced rapid dementia, extreme confusion lethargy, poor motor skills. Exactly what you've been reporting. The receiver felt cold and slick in my hand. I felt a wave of nausea so powerful it almost dropped me to my knees. My grief, my struggle to accept his rapid decline. Every tear I had shed over his confusion, every moment of despair had been manufactured. Genevieve wasn't waiting for him to decline. She was actively, brutally accelerating it. She was poisoning him to steal his life, and I, his loyal granddaughter, had been blindly administering a cover story for 2 years. The betrayal was so deep, so absolute, it hit me with the force of a physical blow, leaving me breathless and dizzy. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and whispered my thanks, hanging up. I had to get Arthur out. Now. I packed his small suitcase, grabbing his medications, determined to put 1,000 miles between us and this toxic house before the family woke up. But as I zipped the bag, I realized running wasn't enough. Running meant surrendering the house and his legacy. Running meant Genevieve won, and Arthur would be left dependent on a system that saw only his dementia, not his manufactured decline. I needed proof. I needed an ally. My mind immediately went to Chloe, my cousin's wife. She had the same look of hunted exhaustion as Robert, the same nervous energy, but beneath it, I remembered a kindness in her eyes. I found her in the enormous, sterile kitchen, moving silently around the industrial-sized island, preparing coffee for the morning crowd. I didn't waste time. I walked up to her, my hand shaking slightly, and placed the empty pill bottle on the gleaming marble countertop. Chloe, my voice was a low rasp, have you seen this? Chloe looked up, and I watched the blood drain from her face. It didn't just drain, it fled. Her hand, which was reaching for a mug, froze mid-air. Her eyes, wide and terrified, landed on the bottle. She stammered, I don't know what that is. Don't lie to me, I pressed, keeping my voice firm but low. This is what Genevieve is using to drug Gramps, to make him incompetent so she can legally take the house tomorrow. Have you seen her use it? She looked at the bottle, then at the kitchen door, then back at me, tears gathering in her lower lashes. She nodded slowly, incrementally. Her voice was barely a breath. She calls it the nectar of quiet. She puts it in his morning tea. She says it's for his nerves, that it keeps him calm. She said the doctor recommended it. My fury ignited hot and clean. I was right. This was calculated murder of the mind. How long? Months, Chloe whispered. Since your grandmother passed. I saw her replace the label. She keeps the real bottle locked in her safe. The full implication of her confession was staggering. Genevieve had been slowly poisoning her own father, making him an invalid while simultaneously parading him around as a symbol of her filial devotion. I have to get him out, I said, grabbing the suitcase. But it was too late. The trap was already set. Genevieve walked into the kitchen wearing a pristine white dressing gown, her hair pulled back in a severe, perfect knot. She smiled, but it was the look of a predator spotting its quarry. Lydia! Up early. She observed, her eyes flicking from my still-packed suitcase to Chloe's horrified expression. She didn't miss a beat. I'm glad you're here. You look stressed, dear. All that driving and caregiving can be quite taxing. She glided around the island, her movement smooth and deliberate. "You know, a little work emergency came up this morning. A client needs your attention immediately. I took the liberty of calling them. They need you to drive back to the city." She wasn't just lying, she was inventing an escape route for me, knowing I would take it because it was so much easier than fighting her. "I'm not leaving," I said, crossing my arms. Genevieve's smile tightened, turning brittle. "Oh, but you must. You can't possibly handle Arthur right now. He's so volatile before the holidays, and you have that important deadline." She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a theatrical whisper meant to convey deep, shared concern. "But don't worry about Arthur. I took the liberty of calling a wonderful long-term care facility. They are sending a specialist team, a white glove evaluation, they call it, to assess his needs. They'll be here tomorrow morning right after the guests arrive. We'll have him moved into a private room by Friday." It was a cold final move. She was having him institutionalized on Thanksgiving Day, under the cover of a family gathering, forcing me out with a fake work emergency, so I couldn't object. The evaluation would use his current drugged state as proof of his advanced decay. It was a trap, and it was closing around his throat. I spun away, panic clawing at my chest. I had to get him now. I flew up the stairs to the blue room, the sound of my own heart deafening. I gripped the knob and rattled it. Locked. I tried the key I had for emergencies, but it didn't turn. This wasn't the usual safety lock. "Gramps, Arthur, are you in there?" I whispered urgently. Silence. Then a low, choked sound. It was a man weeping. It wasn't Arthur. It was Robert. The sound of weeping was muffled but unmistakable. It was ragged, deep, and utterly despairing. It wasn't the sound of an old man crying. It was the sound of a middle-aged man breaking. I didn't hesitate. I fumbled in my pocket for the thin piece of metal I used to reset my router, a tiny flat edge that was surprisingly good for simple tumbler locks. My fingers, trembling with adrenaline, worked quickly. There was a quiet click, and the door swung inward. The blue room felt cold despite the heating. Arthur lay on the immense four-poster bed, looking small and pale, his breathing shallow. He was clearly drugged, eyes half closed, far away. Robert Genevieve's perpetually jovial, outwardly successful husband was slumped in the velvet armchair beside the bed, his head buried in his hands. "Uncle Robert," I whispered, closing the door softly behind me. He flinched violently, snapping his head up. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face, usually flushed with the perpetual ease of wealth, was gaunt. He looked like a prisoner of war. "Lydia," he choked out, wiping his face frantically with the back of his hand. He looked terrified, not of me, but of being discovered. "What are you doing here? You need to leave. If Jen finds you—" "She already tried to send me away." I cut in, my voice low and fierce. "And I know what she's doing to Gramps. I know about the pills. I know she's trying to declare him incompetent by Friday." Robert didn't try to deny it. He just covered his face again and let out a sound of pure misery. "I can't let her do it." He confessed the words raw and barely audible. "Not this time. I swore to Helen I'd look out for him." I knelt beside him, keeping my voice steady and practical, forcing him to engage with my lucidity instead of his panic. "Then tell me, Uncle Robert. Tell me what is going on. I need the truth." He hesitated, looking toward the door. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't turn on the recorder yet, I just held it up. "If you tell me everything, she can't use you anymore. She can't hurt you anymore." He broke. He didn't just confess. He vomited the truth out in a desperate flood of words. "She's not just greedy, Liddy. She's a monster. A true monster." He revealed that he was not weak-willed. He was a victim of decades of calculated, controlling abuse. He had been Genevieve's emotional and sometimes physical punching bag since their wedding. "The man you see, the laughing, backslapping Robert, that's the man she created. The minute the door closes, I'm nothing." His voice cracked, filled with shame. Then came the financial bomb. The entire Blackwell fortune, the one everyone assumed was bolstering the Harper name, was gone, wiped out 10 years ago in a series of disastrous high-risk investments Genevieve had made in secret, fueled by her pathological need for social dominance. "We've been living on credit and the appearance of wealth for a decade," he whispered. "The foundation, the board seat, the lavish parties, it's all a desperate scaffolding. She's not just stealing Arthur's money, she's desperate to liquidate his assets, to steal the Harper legacy, to pay off debts and maintain her facade." The second revelation was even darker. I held up the photos of the strange woman I'd found in the green hat box. "Who is this? Sarah," he said, tears welling up again. "Sarah was the woman I was going to leave Jen for 15 years ago. She was my ticket out." He swallowed hard. "Jen found out. She didn't rage. She smiled, Liddy. She always smiles when she's doing something terrible." He recounted a terrifying, chilling sequence of events. Sarah hadn't left. She had been coerced and then brutalized. Robert claimed Genevieve set up a situation, luring Sarah to a remote cabin. She didn't push her," Robert whispered, trembling. "But she made sure she fell. Sarah didn't die, but she was crippled. She'll never walk again. Genevieve has held the secret of my affair and my perceived complicity in the accident over my head ever since. I'm legally trapped. She threatens to expose me, to destroy me socially, to paint me as an adulterer who harmed an innocent woman. I'm too terrified to fight back." The depth of the family's rot was paralyzing. This was more than a greedy aunt. This was a criminal enterprise disguised as a high society marriage. Genevieve was an abuser, a thief, and potentially a criminal who had manufactured a physical tragedy. I saw the path laid out before me, the only one that led to safety and justice. This was the weapon. I didn't hesitate this time. I unlocked my phone, opened the voice recorder app, and placed it discreetly on the bedside table facing Robert. "Uncle Robert," I said, my voice cutting through his despair. "You are safe now. You are safe here with me. But to stay safe, you have to tell your story again. For the record." I saw the flicker of his eyes, the final agonizing calculation. Freedom or eternal fear? "Tell me again," I urged. "Tell me everything. About the money, about Sarah, about the pills you saw her mix this morning. Tell me exactly how she's destroying this family." He looked at Arthur, then at me. He nodded once, a decisive wrenching motion, and for the next 30 minutes, as Arthur slept soundly in his drugged stupor, Robert poured out the truth. He detailed the high-interest loans, the shell corporations Genevieve set up, the exact amounts of money she was trying to steal from Arthur's estate, and the years of terrifying psychological abuse he endured. It was a complete tear-filled confession, detailing decades of financial fraud and personal misery. Just as he finished wiping his eyes and taking a shaky breath, the doorknob rattled. Hard. "Robert Arthur, it's time for dinner." Genevieve's voice sang sickeningly cheerful from the hallway. "We're having a special toast before the meal. Everyone is waiting." I snatched the phone, my heart slamming against my ribs. I made eye contact with Robert, a silent understanding passing between us. The dinner wasn't dinner at all. It was the public execution of Arthur Harper's will. The final trap was sprung. We walked down the long, sweeping staircase, Arthur leaning heavily on the custom-made mahogany walker that felt far too elegant for its purpose. Robert followed behind us, a ghost of a man, his fear radiating off him in cold waves. The air in the foyer was thick with the scent of pine and expensive perfume. The dining room was a spectacular, terrifying stage. The massive oak table polished to a mirror sheen seated 22 people. This was not a family dinner. It was a community performance. The room was illuminated by a dazzling chandelier that caught the light on crystal and silver. The guests were the power brokers of the entire county, the mayor of our small town flanked by his wife, the rigid silver-haired head of the First National Bank, who controlled the Harper Foundation's primary accounts, and half a dozen members of the philanthropic board, women and men whose social standing Genevieve both cultivated and ruthlessly protected. They all looked up as we entered, and the low hum of conversation died instantly. All 22 pairs of eyes landed on me. Genevieve stood at the head of the table beside the ornate chair reserved for Arthur. She was wearing a deep emerald velvet dress that made her look regal and utterly lethal. Her smile was blinding, a social executioner about to deliver the final blow. "Father," she trilled, moving toward Arthur with practiced warmth. She ignored Robert completely. She took Arthur's arm, gently guiding him to his seat of honor, a seat he would occupy for the last time as the rightful patriarch. Then she turned to me. Her eyes traveled slowly, deliberately from my practical wool trousers to my sensible knit top, lingering on the subtle, exhausted slump of my shoulders. The entire room waited. "Lydia, dear." She sighed, a delicate, almost maternal sound that conveyed profound disappointment. "We really weren't expecting you to stay for the meal, not with your duties." My jaw tightened. "I wouldn't miss Thanksgiving with my family." Genevieve chuckled, a brittle, high-pitched sound that grated on my nerves. "Oh, darling, of course, but you know how it is. We have quite the crowd tonight. I'm afraid the main table is reserved for our partners and board members. We couldn't possibly squeeze another place setting." She paused, letting the silence hang heavy, letting the guests absorb the insult. "You're a caregiver, dear, a wonderful one, of course. But you know your place. If you'll just take your meal in the kitchen, Chef Marco has a perfectly lovely vegetarian option prepared. You can sit at the little staff table in the back. That's always more comfortable when you need to be up and down checking on Arthur." The banishment was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It wasn't just an insult, it was a class-based execution. She was stripping me of my identity as Arthur's granddaughter and cementing me as the hired help, a position of servitude that was beneath the notice of the town's elite. I felt the heat rise up my neck. I saw the polite, practiced pity in the eyes of the bank president, the subtle, condescending amusement in the eyes of the mayor's wife. I was small, worthless, and hysterical. That's what they saw. But underneath the burning shame, the cold rage of knowing the truth held me steady. I was shaking, yes, but not with fear, with suppressed violence. I had the audio evidence pressed tight against my thigh. I had Robert, broken and willing to testify, standing silent and terrified behind me. The shame lasted only a second, replaced by a crystalline focus. She had made her move. Now it was my turn. I took a deep, silent breath. "Thank you, Aunt Genevieve," I said, my voice shockingly level. I didn't move toward the kitchen. I stood my ground just behind Arthur's chair. "But I think I'll stand." The guests shifted, sensing the break in the performance. Genevieve's smile wavered, a hairline fracture in the porcelain mask. She recovered instantly, raising her perfectly sculpted chin. "Very well. Now if we could all settle. Robert, darling, you're looking a bit flushed. Come sit." Robert hurried to his seat, eyes glued to the white tablecloth, praying for invisibility. Genevieve tapped a delicate silver spoon against her crystal water glass. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was sharp, demanding attention. The entire room fell silent. "A toast," she announced, her voice booming with self-satisfaction. "To family and to new beginnings." She launched into a flawless, practiced monologue about the Harper legacy, the responsibility of wealth, and the need for prudent, forward-thinking management. She spoke of Arthur in the past tense, as a historical figure whose time had passed, and then smoothly transitioned to the true purpose of the dinner. "As many of you know," she continued, her gaze sweeping the table, resting momentarily on the bank president. "Father, in his wisdom, and after a long, candid discussion with myself and my legal counsel, has decided to transfer his entire estate, including his majority control of the Arthur Harper Foundation, to my new entity, the Harper Legacy and Stewardship Trust." A ripple of murmured approval went through the room. This was the news they had come for. The formal transfer of power. Genevieve had secured her position as the new unchallenged matriarch. And as a generous first act of stewardship, she declared, her chest swelling with pride, "The trust has agreed to finally relieve the county of the burden of maintaining this increasingly expensive and dilapidated old property." My blood went cold, not just at the malice, but at the sheer casual finality of it. "We will be donating the historic Harper House to the town," she said, using air quotes around donating. "Of course, this will happen after the property has been properly liquidated and the prime riverfront land sold to our partners at New England Development. They are so eager to build that new luxury condominium complex." It was a final breathtaking act of cultural betrayal. Arthur, the master architect who had designed the house as a monument to timeless local architecture, whose entire career was built on building up the community, was about to have his legacy literally bulldozed and sold for quick profit. She wasn't just stealing his money. She was destroying his memory and his gift to the town. As the board members, eager for the potential development fees and kickbacks, reached for their glasses, a powerful, chilling calm settled over me. The shame was gone. The hysteria was gone. All that remained was the hard, cold core of my purpose. She had just publicly announced a criminal act predicated on fraud and the drugging of her own father. She was moments from success. I straightened my spine, feeling the weight of the phone in my pocket. I looked at Genevieve, whose face was alight with triumph. "He didn't agree to anything," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the silence of the room it felt like a gunshot. The sound of clinking glasses stopped. Genevieve didn't look angry. She looked annoyed, like a conductor whose musicians missed a cue. She lowered her glass, her eyes narrowing. "Lydia, I told you, you are distracting the dinner party. You will leave now." "I'm not distracting anything," I said, my voice gaining strength, shaking only slightly now, but clear. "I'm exposing a fraud. He didn't agree to transfer the house. He can't. Not when he's being drugged by a high-dose sedative that mimics advanced dementia." The room erupted in a dozen panicked whispers. The mayor started to rise. Genevieve's eyes flashed dangerous and reptilian. "Get out," she hissed, her social facade cracking, "or I will have you arrested for trespassing." I shook my head slowly, never taking my eyes off her. "You can call the police, Aunt Genevieve, but I won't be the one they take away." Then I looked across the table, not at the triumphant Genevieve, but at the cowering, broken man who held the key. "Robert," I commanded, my voice flat and final. Tell them how you saw her do it. Tell them about the pills. Tell them why you're crying." The entire room pivoted to Robert. He was locked in a horrific tableau of fear. His face was pure white, his eyes darting frantically between his wife and me, between the truth and the terror of her power. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His lips trembled, and his silence was deafening. The golden boy had frozen. The trap was still closing. Robert stood, paralyzed, his eyes wide and vacant, unable to speak, unable to move. The weight of 3 decades of abuse had finally crushed him into silence. Genevieve seized the vacuum instantly. She let out a short, cold, dismissive laugh that echoed around the massive room. "Lydia, you truly are a pathetic, dramatic child," she said, her voice smooth and scornful, but with an underlying thread of pure malice. "My husband is simply shocked by your disgusting lies. You come here, a failed developer working hourly coding jobs, and try to blackmail a respectable family. You accuse me of drugging my own father. What utter unhinged lunacy. If Arthur is incompetent, it's because of the overwhelming stress you have placed on him." She turned to the mayor, her face regaining its composure. "Mr. Jennings, I apologize for this performance. The strain of full-time caregiving clearly broke the poor girl's mind. We will have her removed immediately." The mayor, sensing the social weight of the situation, nodded tentatively. The bank president began to clear his throat. The moment was slipping away, melting back into Genevieve's control. Robert was lost. I was standing alone against the weight of wealth tradition and her relentless, polished lie. I didn't waste time arguing. My hands moved quickly and cleanly. I reached into my shoulder bag and pulled out the small charcoal-gray Bluetooth speaker I used to play Arthur his old jazz records. I set it down on the sideboard next to the magnificent silver ice bucket. I didn't even look at Genevieve. I looked at the bank president, the man who held the purse strings. I looked at the board members. I wanted them to know that I wasn't speaking to the family. I was speaking to the law. I took the final, terrifying leap of faith. I pressed play. Robert's voice, raw, ragged, and thick with tears, filled the suddenly cavernous dining room. It was not the jovial boom of the golden boy. It was the broken confession of the victim. She puts it in his morning tea. She calls it nectar of quiet soul, but it's a sedative. It mimics the decay. I saw her replace the label, the pharmacy label. She's been draining the accounts for years, Liddy. We're functionally bankrupt. This legacy transfer isn't for the foundation. It's to stop the creditors. She's terrified. The sound was devastating in the opulent room. The clatter of a silver spoon on china was the only immediate response. Genevieve's head snapped around her face, registering shock, then disbelief, then a tidal wave of pure, concentrated fury. She started toward the speaker, but Robert's voice continued relentless and damning, laying bare her years of cruelty. I saw what she did to Sarah. Sarah was the woman I loved. Jen found out. She didn't push her, but she set the scene, the icy steps, the accident. She crippled her, Liddy. She told me she'd do the same to me if I ever told anyone. She's not human. She's a monster. The final word hung in the air, monster. The room was in chaos, but a silent, paralyzed chaos. The mayor's jaw hung slightly ajar. The bank president, a man whose life revolved around mitigating risk, looked like he was watching his entire portfolio go up in flames. This wasn't a family squabble. It was a RICO case being played out over Thanksgiving dinner. Genevieve let out a sound that was less a shriek and more a guttural roar, primal and terrifying. The mask didn't just crack, it exploded. All pretense of the elegant philanthropist vanished, replaced by a violent, crazed animal. She didn't lunge at the speaker or at me. She lunged straight across the table at Robert. You miserable, spineless failure! She shrieked, knocking over her crystal water glass. Water spilled across the damask linen. I made you. I gave you everything. You were nothing before me. Her hands were clawed, reaching for his throat. Robert screamed, not in defiance but in absolute terror, scrambling backward as she vaulted over the polished surface, tripping over a centerpiece of white orchids. The sight of the town's grande dame, the chair of the philanthropic board, attacking her husband with the savage fury of an exposed abuser, confirmed every word of the audio. The guests collectively lurched backward, pushing their chairs away from the table, desperate to avoid the eruption of raw physical violence. At that moment, as Genevieve was physically restrained by two of the stunned board members, a quiet, almost imperceptible movement cut through the pandemonium. It was Chloe, the quiet, observant daughter-in-law. She walked with a steady, almost serene pace around the chaos. She didn't look at Genevieve or Robert. Her eyes were fixed on the bank president, Mr. Davies, who was trying to wipe the spilled water from his expensive suit. Mr. Davies, Chloe said, her voice entirely calm, entirely sober, standing out against the background noise of Genevieve's muffled raving. The audio confirms the emotional and physical coercion, but you need the documentation for the wire fraud. She reached beneath the ornate console table where the dessert trays were meant to be placed. She didn't pull out the empty hat box I'd found. She pulled out a small, heavy metal safety box, a true safe box, painted in the same deep forest green. This is the real green box Arthur was talking about, Chloe announced, placing it gently but firmly on the clean part of the tablecloth. It contains the second set of books, the ledger. She turned to Genevieve, a flicker of pure disgust crossing her face. I was your executive assistant for 3 years, Genevieve. You thought I was too stupid, too meek, too busy raising your grandson to pay attention to your accounts. You had me file every shell corporation and offshore transfer. I have the digital copies and the originals here. She handed Mr. Davies a small key. The accounts are detailed chronologically. You'll find documentation of a $7.2 million transfer that was meant to go into Arthur's principal endowment, diverted instead into a private holding company 2 weeks ago. You will also find evidence of every personal asset she liquidated over the last 4 years, using the foundation as a tax shield. Chloe had been playing the long game. She wasn't just an ally. She was the internal auditor, the silent recorder of every crime. She had been waiting for the moment when Genevieve's downfall would be public, decisive, and irreversible, ensuring her own safety and freedom from the toxic family. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. This was no longer just an accusation that could be covered up. It was proof. The bank president took the key, his hands trembling with professional anxiety, not personal fear. Genevieve stopped fighting. She just stared at Chloe, her mouth agape, her eyes filled with a terrifying, vacant hatred. The betrayal of her long-suffering, meek daughter-in-law was the final, unexpected cut. As the police, finally summoned by a panicked kitchen staff member, began to file into the room, Genevieve was silent, utterly defeated. The chaos began to settle into the grim, cold silence of a crime scene. Robert, now free from Genevieve's immediate grip, stood up straight. He looked at the bank president, then back at me. His face was streaked with tears and shame, but there was a nascent strength in his posture I'd never seen before. "The house," Robert choked out his voice, still shaky but no longer terrified. "The entire plot. It wasn't just to get the money. It was to steal it from Lydia. She was trying to break the trust." He took a shaky breath, looking at the stunned faces of the community leaders. "Arthur, my father-in-law, he didn't just talk to her lawyer. He talked to mine. 5 years ago, he put the Harper house and the controlling interest in the foundation into a blind trust for Lydia. It was his final brilliant piece of architecture. It was untouchable. Genevieve couldn't touch it. All this, the pills, the humiliation, the forced transfer, it was to try and get Arthur to revoke the trust voluntarily before she lost everything else. She was racing against the clock because the house was never going to be hers. My head swam. I wasn't just the loyal granddaughter. I was the rightful heir. Arthur hadn't been defeated. He had seen this coming. He had built his own defense years in advance, securing my future. Genevieve, hearing this, let out a moan of agonizing despair. Her reign was over. Her life as she knew it was over. I looked over at Arthur, slumped still in his grand chair, oblivious to the police lights and the murmuring crowd. He was in his own world, but as my gaze fell on him, something shifted. His head slowly turned toward me. The haze lifted for a single, perfect second. His eyes were clear, bright, and utterly filled with love. He smiled a wide, genuine, proud smile, the first one I'd seen in years. "That's my Liddy," he whispered, his voice weak but distinct. "My girl." The lucidity vanished as quickly as it came, but the message was clear. I hadn't just saved him. I had fulfilled his final design. The climax was over. The monster was exposed, and I stood exhausted but whole in the ashes of the Harper family. The flash of police lights cast strobing red and blue over the manicured lawn, painting the grand facade of the Harper house in the harsh colors of emergency. The chaos of the dining room had subsided, leaving behind a chilling functional efficiency. Detectives were taking statements. Crime scene tape, the antithesis of holiday ribbon, was being rolled out near the kitchen entrance. Genevieve, stripped of her velvet formality, was being led away by 2 uniformed officers. She wasn't fighting anymore. She looked small, pale, and utterly defeated, her eyes locked ahead in cold, silent denial. I watched it all unfold from the back steps of the porch, wrapped in a thick utilitarian wool blanket I'd found in the hall closet. I felt no immediate sense of triumph, just a profound, hollow exhaustion. The adrenaline had drained away, leaving behind a bitter metallic taste in my mouth and a deep ache behind my eyes. I had spent 2 years fighting a silent shadow, Arthur's decline, only to discover the shadow had a name and a bank account. Now the shadow was gone, and I was left sitting in the radioactive ash of my entire family. A low, comforting voice broke the silence. "Here." It was Chloe. She handed me a steaming mug of black coffee, her own face reflecting the grim reality of the night. She sat down beside me on the cold stone steps, not too close, but close enough to share the warmth of the blanket. "She'll try to spin it," I said, my voice hoarse. "She'll say Robert was coerced. She'll say I'm a hysterical, vindictive girl who's been fighting the will for years." Chloe nodded, taking a slow sip of her own coffee. "She absolutely will. She's a professional manipulator." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metallic flash drive. She placed it in my hand. It was still warm. "But she won't get away with it." I gave the detectives the hard copies and the bank president the ledger, but this is the insurance. I looked down at the drive. "It's the whole dinner," Chloe explained quietly. My pocket was recording audio too, but I had my phone wedged in a flower arrangement on the sideboard recording video. The whole scene, her face when you played Robert's confession, her attack on him, the absolute unhinged fury. It proves Robert's fear was justified. It proves the physical coercion. Her social and legal credibility is over. Her life, as she knew it, is over. I gripped the blanket, the small drive feeling enormous in my palm. This wasn't just evidence, it was total control. I was holding the power to decide how high the flames of Genevieve's downfall would reach. A figure emerged from the shadows near the garage. It was Robert. He looked utterly diminished. His shoulders slumped, his eyes red and swollen. He was no longer the jovial uncle or the cowering victim, he was just a man. He walked slowly over to the porch, stopping a respectful distance away. He wasn't going with Genevieve. He was a key witness, finally free, but shackled by decades of shame. "Lydia," he said, his voice barely steady, I owe you everything. You saved me. You saved yourself, Uncle Robert," I replied, my voice flat. "When you told me the truth." He nodded, accepting the correction. "Yes. But there's something you need to know about the house. It's yours, truly yours." He confirmed what he had blurted out in the dining room. Arthur hadn't been defeated. He had been brilliant. "Arthur didn't trust Genevieve even a little bit after your grandmother died," Robert explained. "He knew she'd try something like this. 5 years ago, he consulted with my firm, the firm Genevieve thought she controlled, and quietly put the Harper house and the controlling interest in the foundation into an irrevocable blind trust with you as the sole beneficiary." He swallowed hard. Genevieve couldn't break it. She needed Arthur to revoke it himself under the guise of an emergency financial restructuring. That's what the pills were for. That's why she was in such a desperate rush to have him declared incompetent. She wasn't trying to get the money. She was trying to steal it back from you, the rightful heir. I looked up at the house, a monument of limestone and history. It wasn't a prison or a performance stage anymore. It was a fortress Arthur had built for me. He had used the one thing Genevieve prized, the appearance of family loyalty, to shield the one person he truly loved. The realization brought the only true clear emotion of the night, a deep, profound love for my grandfather. He had seen me. He had chosen me. Robert looked down at the grounds, his eyes distant. "I'll stay. I'll testify. I'll make sure she never hurts anyone again." He straightened slightly. "And I'll start by taking care of the grounds. The gardens. I always liked the gardens." He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was finding a way to pay his debt. I watched him walk away toward the dark, manicured lawn. I was alone again, but the feeling was different. The exhaustion was still there, but beneath it lay a solid foundation of purpose. I had fought not for money, but for truth. The house was mine. And tomorrow, I would start to build something new from the wreckage. 1 year later, the sprawling limestone manor felt completely different. It was spring again, and the maples along the driveway were no longer bare but bursting with soft green vitality. The scent of lilacs freshly bloomed in the gardens hung in the air, sweet and clean. The gates to the Harper house were open. Literally. I had them unlocked and fixed in place. No more stiff metallic barrier demanding exclusivity. I sat on the front porch, the morning sun warming the stone steps. Arthur was beside me, wrapped in that old oatmeal-colored sweater that Genevieve had scorned. His dementia had progressed as the doctor warned it eventually would, but the terror was gone. The cold fear that had haunted his eyes for years, fueled by the pills, had completely vanished. He was calm, holding my hand, humming a soft, wordless tune. He was at peace, sheltered in the fortress he had built. Genevieve had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud and physical abuse against her husband, largely thanks to Robert's testimony and Chloe's meticulous ledger. The ensuing legal battle was brutal but clean. The house and the foundation were mine, entirely mine. I hadn't kept the house as a monument to myself. I had kept it as a monument to Arthur's legacy, the one based on community, not hoarding. With the help of Chloe, now my invaluable and very well-paid estate manager, I had immediately set about transforming the space. We'd audited the funds, restored the legal foundation, and renamed the entire operation the Harper Community Trust. The old sterile ballroom where Genevieve used to host her terrifying social performances was now the Arthur Harper Digital Literacy Center. I had brought in state-of-the-art computers, leveraging my skills to build a free educational space for the community. The enormous manicured lawns, which used to be only for show, were now public gardens and picnic spots. I stood up and stretched, looking out at the grounds. Robert was there too, not in a suit but in faded jeans and a baseball cap, tending to the massive rose bushes. He looked years younger. The perpetual anxiety that had been plastered on his face was gone, replaced by the quiet concentration of physical labor. He was paying his penance by tending to the grounds, the physical earth of the family. He had failed, finding a quiet, honest peace in the work. He was free from Genevieve's tyranny and was choosing to stay here, finding sanctuary and purpose. Chloe walked out onto the porch carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She was no longer meek or terrified. She was poised, sharp, and the architect of her own career. We had built a new kind of family together, one based on shared values and mutual respect, not blood or obligation. "The after-school coding group is starting in the ballroom," Chloe informed me, handing me a glass. "And the mayor called. He wants to know if he can hold the next town meeting here. Said the town hall feels too stuffy now." I smiled, looking at the familiar but newly vibrant house. "Tell the mayor yes. Tell him the doors are open." My own life was unrecognizable. I wasn't just Arthur's caregiver or the girl in the kitchen. I was a founder, a steward, the face of a genuine philanthropic effort. I had taken the vast wealth and status that my aunt worshipped and had transmuted it into a real, tangible good. I had transformed a symbol of private, hidden abuse into a public space of safety and growth. I had agency. I walked over to Arthur, who was watching the hummingbirds dart around the lilac bushes. He turned his head and gave me a soft, distant look. I leaned down and kissed his forehead. The betrayal had nearly destroyed me, but my response had rebuilt me from the ground up, stronger and clearer than I ever could have been had I stayed in that tiny apartment coding alone. I watched a local family setting up a small picnic blanket on the lawn near the huge, sprawling oak tree. A little girl about 5 was chasing bubbles. They weren't wealthy or privileged. They were just community. They were exactly who Arthur had built this house for. I was the master of the house now, but I was not its queen. I was its anchor. The house was a home not for the few but for the many. I had my grandfather, I had my chosen family, and most importantly, I had my own hard-won freedom. The fire was out, the ashes were swept, and the spring air was promising. My journey from vulnerability to empowerment was complete, and the new legacy had just begun. And so Lydia closed the most painful chapter of her life, choosing not just to survive the betrayal, but to transform it into a force for good. If you were gripped by Lydia's journey from vulnerability to empowerment, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dive stories. We read every single comment of your thoughts on Genevieve's ultimate downfall. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.